And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there and welcome to Brazier. Some fast-paced news from 4 until 6 coming up for you in the next hour. 6 p.m. will be the moment of truth for several Tory prime ministerial wannabes. It's the deadline for candidates to secure the backing of 20 of their fellow MPs. Who's in, who's out? Expect some movement as early as this hour. Also, Labour pushing today for a no-confidence vote in the Boris Johnson government. They don't have the numbers, do they? So why are they even bothering? We'll discuss. And thousands of people marching at 18 locations across Northern Ireland to mark the 12th of July, the annual Orange Order parades. And with me for the next 2 hours, Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, just as soon as he arrives. First, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Well, the pressure is on the Conservative candidates now to secure enough nominations, as Colin was saying, to formally enter the race to replace Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has confirmed she won't be standing. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, bowed out and gave his support to the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. So that leaves 10 contenders now who need the support of 20 MPs by 6 o'clock this evening. 3 have officially launched campaigns today with speeches, and tax policy has been central. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak saying he would lower the tax burden when inflation has been brought under control.
My message to the party and the country is simple. I have a plan to steer our economy through these headwinds. We need a return to traditional Conservative economic values, and that means honesty and responsibility, not fairy tales.
Well, prominent Tory backbenchers Tom Tugendhat is promising to provide a new sense of direction for the party.
We need leadership with a renewed sense of mission. Leadership that sees beyond divisive politics and delivers results. Leadership that will return government to the service of our economy, our people and our country. We need a clean start.
And the former Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, launched her campaign by saying her focus would be on the truth.
Governing involves trade-offs, and we need to start being honest about that. Unlike others, I'm not going to promise you things without a plan to deliver them. People are sick of that. They're crying out for honesty.
Meanwhile, the Labour Party's put forward a motion to hold a confidence vote in the government itself. The official opposition says Boris Johnson should have left number 10 immediately after he resigned as Tory leader last week. If the ballot goes ahead, expected to be tomorrow, all MPs can vote on whether the Conservatives stay in power. If the government loses, it could trigger a national election. Well, in other news today, the government's announced a £1 billion plan to rebuild 61 schools. In James Cleverly's first announcement as the new Education Secretary, he said schools would receive state-of-the-art refurbishments. The investments will provide thousands of pupils with modern classrooms, as well as new sports halls, music rooms and science labs. Japan has said goodbye to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated last week. Amid a heavy police presence, close family and friends of Japan's longest-serving premier attended a private funeral service in Tokyo. Abe was shot when he was making a speech at a campaign event. After the ceremony, a hearse carrying his body was accompanied by police on a procession through the city. Heathrow Airport has introduced a cap on the number of daily passengers that pass through its terminals. The measure's been introduced as the airline industry struggles to deal with demand. Between July and September, no more than 100,000 passengers will be able to depart from the airport in West London. And the Queen has presented the George Cross to the NHS at Windsor Castle. The monarch and Prince Charles welcomed NHS bosses and a frontline worker from each of the 4 UK nations. The award recognises acts of great heroism and courage in the face of extreme danger. And Downing Street says significant work is being done to protect the most vulnerable during the current heatwave. A spokesperson says planning is underway within the NHS, local councils and transport networks. That comes after the Met Office issued an amber alert for extreme heat for Sunday, covering most of England and parts of Wales, warning of possible dangers to life. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Five past 4. Thanks for watching. Coming up in the next couple of hours, loads of politics. And guess what? It's interesting. In the next couple of hours, it will be the moment of truth for several Tory prime ministerial wannabes. 6 p.m. marks the deadline for candidates to secure the backing of 20 fellow MPs. If they don't, they are out. This afternoon, the shape of the looming contest really did begin to take shape. There are currently 4 candidates who we know, or we think we know, have reached the threshold of 20 MPs. They are Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, Tom Tugendhat and Liz Truss. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, threw in the towel and threw in his lot with Rishi Sunak. I see that Matt Hancock, the former Health Minister, has done the same. I wonder how much of an impression that's going to make. Priti Patel decided not to run in the last few hours, the Home Secretary. And we also saw the frontrunners holding official campaign launches, amongst them the early pacemaker and current bookies' favourite, the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak.
I will have no part in a rewriting of history that seeks to demonise Boris, exaggerate his faults or deny his efforts.
Well, somebody who's doing far better than some people expected, Tom Tugendhat, has pointed to his military career when asked about his lack of ministerial experience.
This is no time to learn. What this is a time to look at a record of service, a record of delivery, under the most difficult and trying conditions around the world, and to see that this isn't learning on the job. This is putting all that experience to work on the job, and the best job and the hardest job in the United Kingdom.
Well, Tom Tugendhat has a bit of a tailwind behind him. So too does Kemi Badenoch, the former Equalities Minister, who said today that while she'll cut taxes were she elected leader, she didn't want to compete with other leaders, or candidates, I should say, to make the biggest cuts.
But I will not enter into a tax bidding war over my tax cuts are bigger than yours. To make promises that you cannot keep is a betrayal of everything that I stand for.
Well, let's turn to Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, and shortly we're going to be joined by David Maddox, political editor of The Express Online, for some jaw about this. Darren, I'm just struck there listening to that clip from Kemi Badenoch. There'll be some of our viewers and listeners for whom that's the first time they've heard her speak. And there are serious people, regular contributors to this news channel and others, who think, seriously, she might be our next Prime Minister.
Yeah, indeed, and there was a whole series of MPs there today. Now, she's not reached quite the threshold yet, but according to her aides, there were effectively 20 MPs in the room, so she will do, ranging from like Lee Rowley and Tom Hunt, who are 2019 intakers, right up to Michael Gove, of course, who served in the Cabinet for quite a long time.
Can I interrupt you and talk about Michael Gove's endorsement of Kemi Badenoch? Because that was pretty unexpected.
It was. And, you know, Michael is viewed, whatever one thinks about him, and I think this afternoon he's been asked whether he's a snake or not, given the comments made by Number 10 last week, something in which he says he's been called all sorts of names in politics. You know, Michael's got an awful lot of respect across the Cabinet, across the government, because he's actually a big thinker who's gone into several government departments and actually got things done. And I think in many ways that is what actually Kemi has amongst her supporters, is the thought that she is a big thinker. She's got ideas and an ideological kind of edge to her that some of the other candidates don't, that is fresh. She's not tainted by kind of close membership or association with this government. and that in the end, she could be the person on the right to kind of properly take on the party ideologically for the next, 18 months, 2 years into that general election campaign. The problem, though, of course, is for lots of supporters who would like to back her, is that sense is, can she win? Because at the moment, even though Priti Patel's not running, kind of the right of the party is somewhat split between kind of Braverman, Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who's clearly trying to get lots of Brexiteers on side, and she had the backing today, didn't she, of Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've got Kemi Badenoch as well. So that vote is kind of split three ways at the moment, and that's proving difficult because clearly that's not sustainable if they are to take on the two most popular candidates at the moment, seemingly among MPs at least, Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt.
And I don't want to create an artificial sense of suspense, but it is quite exciting the next couple of hours, isn't it? Because, we've got this 6 p.m. deadline, after which we'll know who's made the cut, who's got the 20 MPs and who hasn't. It's entirely possible, and we saw Priti Patel fall away today, it's entirely possible that somebody like Jeremy Hunt, who, a few weeks ago people would have said, he's in the runoff, mate. He will make it to the last two. He may not make it across the threshold into the contest.
Into the first round. Sajid Javid so far has struggled to get 20... and it is interesting because if that is the case, and it is entirely possible, if they do drop out and decide to back someone else today, where do their supporters go? Because in theory, yes, sometimes they do follow the same suit. Grant Shapps today coming up to Rishi Sunak, but not all his MPs have decided to kind of fall into line behind Rishi Sunak. I think Paul Bristow, for example, has gone and backed Liz Truss instead. So that's the really interesting, unpredictable element to all this, Colin, in many regards, is that, yes, there are these MPs who've got lots of supporters, but where they break kind of with the different candidates will determine how this contest goes.
Just one final thought. We mentioned that Kemi Badenoch has come through. Tom Tugendhat, I think, is probably, it's fair to say, the other surprise package so far. I've come across them a couple of times. You've come across them, I'm sure, many times. One thing that comes across loud and clear, fabulous piece by James Kirkup yesterday, I think in The Spectator, maybe in The Telegraph, saying, what really comes across from everybody who gets to know him a little bit is the quality of the man's character. And it's quite interesting that some of the people backing him are not natural ideological bedfellows. They've got a bit of a problem with his lack of ministerial experience. They've certainly got a problem with the fact he voted for Remain in the referendum. They've even got a problem with the fact he dissed, Roger Scruton, the sort of philosopher king of conservative ideology. They like him. But they like him.
They like him and they trust him. And that's the really interesting thing, I think. And the same could be said about Kemi Badenoch as well, in the sense that those supporters are very, very enthusiastic. They really, really like these two politicians. I'm not entirely sure that's true of all the other candidates in this. Clearly, this is a political race, and there'll be a lot of people looking at Rishi Sunak, a lot of people looking at Liz Truss, maybe even Penny Mordaunt, and they're backing them, yes, some for ideological reasons, but also because they think they're backing the right horse, let's be honest about this, Colin, and they think it will be very good for their political careers too. I mean, Grant Shapps, I'm sure, is hoping that he will remain in the cabinet by coming out and backing Rishi Sunak if Rishi Sunak wins. But you're right, it is fascinating that these two politicians, the kind of outsiders, if you like, who are presenting this clean start, have also got the backers and the enthusiasm of the supporters, not just because of ideology, but also because they're seen as quite likeable characters who can be trusted, who've got integrity, and actually have got a thought process for changing not just the Conservative Party, but the country.
Darren, we'll let you go. Thanks very much indeed. I know you've got a very busy couple of hours or thereabouts. We're going to let you swap places with David Maddox from The Express. As that operation is underway, let me tell you or share with you the thoughts of Michael Gove. We were just discussing Michael Gove, former Secretary of State for Levelling Up, many other jobs in government, of course, as well, who has been asked about Boris Johnson, parting of the ways between those two men. He's described it as a process that was very equable, very polite. When he sacked me, said Michael Gove, he was, as he's always been in conversation with me, very equable, very polite. And obviously I'm not surprised because earlier in the day I'd gone to see him privately. I'd explained to him that while I regretted it, there was a grim political reality facing us. Michael Gove talking about what happened on the day that Boris Johnson decided to throw in the towel. David Maddox, then, political editor of The Express, not The Express, The Express Online, who joins me here. David, welcome. Who's going to make it at 6 o'clock? Who gets across the line? Who doesn't? Go on. Let me just go straight in for the kill.
Right. So clearly Rishi Sunak's going to make it. Clearly Liz Truss is going to make it. Kemi, I believe, has got the numbers, not all declared openly, but Suella Braverman has got the numbers, not all declared openly. Some of them borrowed, I suspect. Sajid Javid, it's looking a bit tenuous.
Jeremy Hunt?
Looking a bit tenuous.
Nadim Zahawi?
Looking a bit tenuous.
I mean,
these were people who were, especially Nadim Zahawi just a couple of weeks ago, people were saying this is a guy who could win. Well, he didn't resign and he became Chancellor instead and then stabbed the Prime Minister in the front.
Is it possible when we write the political obituaries of Nadim Zahawi, might it be that he had one day was a pinnacle of his political career,
yes.
and then...
Yeah, when he went in that kind of fateful evening, he should have resigned if he wanted to be Prime Minister.
We're looking at the tabulation of the votes, and I think, Rishi's up to 40-something. Tom Tugendhat, maybe 20, 21. He's crossed the boundary necessary.
Yes, he's got the numbers as well.
But the point's been made to me, and I'm sure you're keen to make it too, that a lot of the MPs are not declaring.
Yes.
A very substantial. Scores and scores of them haven't told anybody how they're voting.
No, and this is quite normal, actually. I'm trying to remember how many leadership contests I've been through, but this is quite normal. They don't want to be associated straight away with how they vote. They want to be able to negotiate their way through. And, there's a lot of game playing. This is the most sophisticated electorate in the world, and maybe the least trustworthy as well. But
just to make my job that little bit easier, I was saying in our meeting earlier that while we were on air before 6 o'clock and the deadline for nominations to close, I thought we'd maybe hear on the grapevine, or at least on Twitter, maybe somebody dropping out. Am I right?
Yes, I think so. I think that's likely. Well, the names we just mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Sajid Javid or Nadim Zahawi. I saw just before I left Parliament to come here, Nadim Zahawi's team were very visible in Portcullis House in Parliament, on the phones, tapping people on the shoulder. So they were obviously clearly desperately trying to get their man over the line. By the looks of their faces, they hadn't succeeded when I left. But, still 2 hours to go. So
it's a rough trade, isn't it, politics? But they know what they're in for. David, I've got some problems with my microphone, so I'm going to say thanks very much indeed. David Maddox from The Express. Let me introduce this story. Hundreds of parades taking place across Northern Ireland today, thousands celebrating the 12th of July. The parades are organised by the Orange Order to commemorate the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Last night, some 250 bonfires were lit in loyalist communities across the region to usher in the main date in the parading calendar. Let's turn to GB News' Northern Ireland reporter, Dougie Beattie. Dougie, over to you.
Well, welcome to Armagh. As you can hear behind me now, the bands are making their way home from the demonstration fields. And they have had a very, very good day. The weather has held on for them. But in amongst the demonstration fields, the talk has been of the protocol and how anti they are to this particular agreement. And they were the people that actually had the 1997-98 peace agreements. The Orange Order had to be persuaded to actually make that work. And of course they are now very much against this protocol. Legislation going through the House tomorrow which will try and end that. And the Orange Order are very keen to see a renegotiation of it.
Competing against quite a lot of background noise there, but thanks very much indeed, Dougie. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, has joined me in the studio to reflect on that story and all the other stories we're covering today. But I think, as a phenomenon, whether you love it or you loathe it, whether you find it problematical in terms of sectarianism, or whether you find it a wonderful spectacle, can we agree that those parades in Northern Ireland don't get the coverage that they would get were they happening on the mainland? On that we can agree, can't we?
Yes, and also it's a remarkable celebration of something that happened over 300 years ago. And actually, you will remember, Colin, these sort of occasions used to be much more fraught 20, 30 years ago. So even people who take against these displays, and I don't, they're a lot more peaceful than they used to be. You'll remember Drumcree, which is a separate thing, but actually this seems to be pretty peaceful, doesn't it?
so far. And, some of the bonfires, I mean, it's an incredible spectacle, though there are people who say, actually, it's incendiary in more than just the way it is around the bonfires. As we look at those pictures, I'm keen to talk to you about another story. I know you've got a story that you want to break.
Yes.
We're talking about breaking a news story?
Definitely.
We're going to break a news story.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with the Loyalist order.
Yeah.
Camilla, one day to be our queen. There's a big ITV documentary. There are books. It's all around. We're learning more about Camilla all the time, aren't we? What do you know?
Well, I must apologise for my state of dress and being slightly sweaty because I've bicycled very quickly we've had an oldie lunch today at the National Liberal Club for Camilla's 75th birthday occasion. All sorts of greats from Tony Blackburn to Leslie Caron were there. And she gave a very nice, charming speech. But in the speech, she very subtly said what she would do as Queen. I don't know if you have the script there. I can read it off my phone if you're happy.
Phone, yeah.
Well, I won't read the whole thing, I promise you. But she said, the Duke of Edinburgh's philosophy was clear. Look up and look out. Say less, do more, and get on with the job. And that is just what I intend to do. Both he and Her Majesty have always been the very touchstone of what it truly means to get on with the job, and an inspiration to each one of us here to do the same, whatever our age. So none of that's controversial, but it is the oldie. I love my magazine, but very rarely breaks scoops. This is a sort of scoop in a very subtle way, because she's quite modest and she knows how difficult it is about the fact that she will be declared Queen, as the current Queen said the other day. But I'm pretty sure this is the first time she has declared what she will do when in the course of time she becomes Queen.
And, the way you read, pass is a better word, P-A-R-S-E. You've got to pass royal speeches, haven't you? And they're Delphic. Yeah. And you've got to pick the meaning that's hidden there sometimes. And I, as a former royal correspondent, I listen to those words and I think, oh, yes, that's really interesting. It's very much following in the Queen's footsteps, say a bit less. And that's fine if you're Camilla. She's never said that much. How does she persuade our future king, her husband, to say a little bit less?
Extremely good point that never explain, never apologise is the famous rule about being a monarch. And Prince Charles famously does speak too much. But in this speech today, it was very uncontroversial. That, in a way, was the most controversial bit. And that's not very controversial, but it's the first time she's admitted what we know is that she will be Queen and that she's not going to be reigning because she's not the actual monarch. But it's the first time she's saying, this is my job in the future. This is what I'll do. And as you say, Colin, do less is a very, very good principle.
And well done to you at the Oldie magazine, getting her to give a speech on her 75th. And a good scoop as well. Harry, thanks very much indeed. Worth waiting for you to come in to talk about it. No, it's fine. You are with Colin Brazier. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. Coming up, the Armed Forces Minister gets a grilling from MPs on the use of the Army and the Navy to counter migrant crossings. The number of people crossing the Channel reached 1,000 in under a week. We'll bring you more.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farah. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Well, more than 1,000 people have crossed the English Channel in less than a week. That figure made life difficult for the Armed Forces Minister. Today, he was getting a grilling from MPs on the use of the Army and the Navy to counter those migrant crossings. Well, let's turn to our Home and Security editor, Mark White, to reflect on what's been happening in the Channel. Mark, in a sense, it's not... I'm not saying it's not a news story, far be it from me to say that, but crossings in the summer, calm seas is one thing. What's new about what's been happening recently is the winter crossings, when the conditions are less clement.
Yes, that's right. We had a significant number who were coming across the Channel during the winter months, probably more than twice the number the year before, which gives you probably an indication of where we're headed later in the year. 28,500 crossed last year. We're looking at more than 60,000, I think, crossing this year. And what's significant about the 1,000 people who've crossed just in the last 6 days is that there was a big international operation that took place. 39 people arrested, people smuggling networks smashed, according to the authorities. 135 of these small boats recovered and associated equipment. And they told us, the authorities in this country and beyond, that this would have a short-term impact on these small boats coming across, because there wouldn't be the ready supply of these vessels that are bought in Turkey, taken to Germany, we're told, are hidden around various sites in Germany before then being driven to northwest France, where they're assembled and put onto the beaches of northwestern France. However, since then, 1,000 have crossed in 25 of these boats, so they're still getting them.
Wow. But what Mark, there was a picture yesterday of one being carried into the sea by about 50 men.
Yeah, it's a big old boat. This is exactly the type of boat that the people smuggling ring allegedly were procuring in Turkey and then taking across via Germany to northwestern France. Our producer down in Kent has told us that his sources on the other side of the Channel have told him that the gangs over there have managed to stash away quite a few of these boats in the countryside around northwestern France, near the beaches where they set off from. So they have a ready supply of vessels for the foreseeable anyway. James Heapy, as you said, he was giving evidence to the Defence Select Committee about the effectiveness of this operation that has been mounted now by the armed forces, taken over control from Border Force in recent months. He says it's actually gone well. His job, though, he says, or the armed forces' job, is not to stop it, but to gain control of the situation in the Channel, to make sure that those crossing into British waters are intercepted safely and taken back to the UK, and that no one, or as few boats as possible, manage to reach the beaches of the UK. This is what he told the Select Committee.
Since defence took primacy, only one migrant boat has landed in the UK in an uncontrolled way. And we define uncontrolled as in we were not physically escorting it, or we hadn't intercepted it and cross-decked people at sea. And even the boat that arrived in what we would describe as an uncontrolled way landed in the vicinity of Dungeness Power Station, and the nuclear civil police were able to intercept them.
So that really sounds impressive. It sounds like you've got the channel under control.
Tobias, you're not going to tempt me to say such grand things, because I just think a run of still days, would test us. Of course it would.
Well, alongside Mark White, Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie. Harry, I'm not sure how much your correspondence, your letters page is filled with the rantings of people who worry about what's happening in the English Channel. But I noticed this paradox that all the Conservative Party leadership candidates endorsed Priti Patel's idea of a Rwanda policy, and yet so much political damage does she seem to have sustained through that policy and others that she can't even make it. Well, in fact, she's removed herself from the ballot earlier today. It is a paradox, isn't it?
It is, but also it's very interesting for the upcoming vote for the Tory candidates that among Tory members, I think it's something like 70%, correct me, who are keen on the Rwanda option. And so you can see, you say she's stood down, but why I think all the candidates so far have backed it, that here you have an option which is extremely popular among Tory members, perhaps slightly less popular in the country, but even less popular among the commentariat.
Mark, before we let you go, just reflect. We're not writing Priti Patel's political obituary. It's entirely possible that whoever is the next Prime Minister after Boris Johnson keeps her in post, says, actually, Priti, you're doing a fantastic job at the Home Office, keep on doing it. But one thing it appears to me is that whoever, whether it's her or if she's succeeded by somebody else, that somebody else will not take the softly line. They can't. The Conservative Party will not let them take a softer line than Priti Patel's taken.
No, they can't afford to, as far as the party's concerned. You're absolutely right. And Priti Patel herself, there's no doubt, has been damaged by this whole crisis. She tried months ago, you remember, more than a year ago now, to give more money, to millions more money to France so that they would step up their patrols across these beaches in northwestern France to try to stop the boats leaving the beaches in the first place. That didn't work. Then, of course, she introduced the turn-back policy, which never actually was carried out in earnest, because even though they bought the jet skis for Border Force to use, people within Border Force were saying it's too dangerous. You start turning these boats back in open sea, you're going to end in tragedy. So that was abandoned. Now you've got Rwanda. Rwanda is mired in political challenges that are still going through the courts. So who would want to take on that job? Priti Patel may stay in the job because
nobody else wants it.
Well, it's a convenient issue to have her in control of if you're Prime Minister, let's say.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Mark White. Is Wales right to lower the speed limit to 20 miles an hour? That's in the newspapers and news websites today. It's a goer, 20 miles an hour in the towns and cities of Wales. We'll be talking about that after today's headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The headlines. Pressure then is on for the Tory leadership candidates to secure enough nominations to formally enter the race to replace Boris Johnson. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, as you've been hearing, says she will not be standing. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, has also bowed out and is now backing the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. So that leaves 10 contenders who need the support of 20 MPs by 6 p.m. today. In other news, Heathrow Airport has introduced a cap on the number of daily passengers passing through its terminals. The measure's been introduced as the airline industry struggles to deal with demand. Between July and September, no more than 100,000 passengers will be able to get through the airport in West London. And more than 1,000 people have now crossed the English Channel in less than a week after an international operation designed to disrupt a people smuggling network. Yesterday, 442 people were pulled off 25 small boats as they tried to make their way into the UK. Today, more than 100 have made the crossing, with operations still ongoing to intercept small boats in the Channel. And Japan has been saying goodbye to the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated last week. Amid a heavy police presence, close family and friends of Japan's longest-serving premier attended a private funeral service in Tokyo. Abe was shot when he was making a speech at a campaign event last week. After the ceremony, a hearse carrying the body was accompanied by police on a procession through the city. The Queen has presented the George Cross to the NHS at Windsor Castle. The monarch and Prince Charles welcomed NHS bosses and a frontline worker from each of the 4 UK nations. The award recognises acts of great heroism and courage in the face of extreme danger. Those are the headlines. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News, where now it's time to go back to Brazier after the break.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
For you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Well, the Labour Party says it will be pushing for a no-confidence vote in the government after Boris Johnson's downfall. The party hopes to secure a vote in the Commons tomorrow to oust the Prime Minister from his, interim position at number 10. But it will certainly rely on backbench Conservative support and, as you're obviously aware, they're pretty preoccupied right now with a leadership campaign that's going on in their party. Let's turn to Ian Murray, the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. Ian Murray, welcome to you. I don't know if you've seen this. You'll know more than the journalist concerned, I imagine. But I'm reading in the Telegraph, their online offering, that your bid for a no-confidence vote in the government has been blocked. As I say, that's in what the Telegraph are saying. What do you know?
Well, that's the only thing we are seeing at the moment, is that's what's breaking on social media. But the government, this will be the first government in history to block such a vote. If the convention in the House of Commons, if the official opposition, whoever that may be, brings a vote of no confidence in the government or the Prime Minister, then that's supposed to be taken either the same day, if there's time in the timetable to do so, or the following day and the timetable is changed to allow that to happen. And that's what we were expecting to do. And I think if the government are trying to block that, it's perhaps they're really worried about losing this vote tomorrow. Otherwise, they would be bringing it on and bringing that to the floor of the House of Commons.
I just feel that they're too busy. I mean, you do accept, don't you, the analysis that says you would need literally dozens of Conservative backbenchers to vote like turkeys for Christmas. I mean, many of them would, in voting for no confidence in this government and triggering an election, would potentially face losing their seats. They're just not going to vote for it.
Well, all you have to do is have a look at the resignation letters from the 60 ministers who resigned last week. They were using words like liar, untrustworthy, and they are wanting this person to stay in Downing Street for several more weeks, and the damage that could do not only to our politics and to our democracy, but also to the country. Many dozens have been calling for an interim Prime Minister to take over whilst a new leader is being elected. We would certainly endorse that message. And if you heard the Prime Minister at the powerful liaison committee last week, he openly admitted that he met with an ex-KGB agent while Foreign Secretary on his own, with no officials, and there's no minutes of what that meeting was about, and they've been very guarded and secretive about what that was about, right at the height of the poisonings on soil in this country. So he's a danger to national security as well, and has to be removed from office. All of those Conservative MPs who said that last week now need to go down the voting lobby and remove him.
I know it's open season on the Prime Minister, and I've heard that allegation, and I sat through the liaison committee and heard the allegations that you heard and you've just repeated. But I mean, just as a point of balance, Number 10 say, well, hang on, this is somebody who was the owner of a major national newspaper in the UK. The way you pitch it sounds pretty shady. They would say there's nothing shady about it at all. I simply let it rest there. Just on the point about the Prime Minister breaking with...
Well, if there's nothing shady about it, publish the minutes.
Can we just talk about the no confidence vote? Just on the point about the Prime Minister breaking with that convention, does that not underline the necessity, some will say, in this country for a written constitution? Because if it's something as profound as the Her Majesty's opposition trying to have a vote of no confidence in the sitting Prime Minister and the government of the day, and the Prime Minister wafting that away, that leaves you nowhere to go. And it will feel to some people that for something as critical within a constitutional democracy as a vote of no confidence in the government, that ought to be somehow enshrined in law.
Well, to a certain extent you're correct, because the conventions of Parliament and the conventions of the House of Commons only work when you have a government who wants to abide by the law and abide by the rules. It's been proven time and time again that this Prime Minister and this government doesn't want to do that, and therefore conventions fall apart. These conventions have been in place for many hundreds of years. There have been successful and unsuccessful votes of no confidence dating all the way back to the 14th century in Parliament behind me. And if this Prime Minister and this government doesn't want to abide by conventions, then you do have to start writing things down into law and into a written codified constitution. That would be incredibly unfortunate, I think, that we'd have to do that on the basis that we've got a Prime Minister that doesn't want to abide by the conventions that every other Prime Minister has abided by for centuries. And I think that tells you more about the man and more about this rotten Conservative government than it tells you about anything else.
Let's imagine for a moment that this hadn't been blocked, that there had been a vote of no confidence, and that this government falls, and that there is a general election, and Labour does pretty well, but can't get into government without the support of those scores of SNP votes that you once would have counted on as safe Scottish Labour seats, but no longer can because they're in the hands of the SNP. The SNP have declared their intention to hold a second referendum. If you want to be in number 10 again, you need the help of the SNP. You win that by saying to them, you can have your referendum.
Well, the answer to both of those questions is no and no, as Keir Starmer and Nass Sauer have laid out time and time again, and will continue to lay out. There'll be no deals going into the election with the SNP, there'll be no deals coming out of the election with the SNP, and we won't be giving them a referendum. Keir Starmer was in Gateshead yesterday making a speech on what he sees as the future of the economy and the way the country should operate in a refreshed government, a refreshed Labour government, and he made it pretty clear we wouldn't be dancing to the tune or allowing anybody anywhere near power who wants to break up the United Kingdom. He wants to be Prime Minister for the whole of the United Kingdom, so we would not be giving them a referendum either. We're being clear on that time and time again, but of course it's in the Conservative interest and in the SNP interest to keep championing this line, and it's simply not true. There'll be no deal, and that's quite clearly what we will keep saying today, yesterday, last month, and all the way up to the next general election.
Ian Murray is the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. Ian Murray, appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount alongside me, just to reflect on that technical point about important matters of parliamentary convention. I mean, it seems to me that there is an argument sometimes for a written constitution. The problem with the written constitution is it just seals in aspect the values of the day, doesn't it?
Yes, and so you see the terrible example of that in America with the right to bear arms. It's very hard to change that. So I'm all for conventions, but there's obviously an inbuilt fault in them that they are just conventions. I'm very surprised, actually, that Boris has blocked it, because isn't it amazing how quick the mood changes in politics? On Thursday morning, when Boris resigned, an awful lot of people were saying he's got to go now. That evening, I went to the Spectator party in Westminster.
Oh, you were invited, yeah.
I was invited. And It was amazing. All the candidates were there except for Liz Truss, who was abroad. And so they're already thinking about the successors. And so already it's terrible how people just move on. They weren't really talking about Boris much. And Graham Brady laid out the rules for the successor coming in September. And so he could still stand down Boris. But that immediate fevered demand for him to go on Thursday morning seems to have disappeared largely only, 5 days later.
Labour would be on stronger grounds, wouldn't they, I suppose, if Graham Brady hadn't said, actually, this will all be done by the 5th of September. And that's in view, isn't it? I mean, once you take the summer recess into consideration.
Yes, and it's been accelerated, hasn't it, because of the idea that he wanted to stay on until Tory conference in October. And so I'd have thought he will hang on, and very quickly people get used to the status quo.
Harry Mount, thanks very much indeed. Let's ponder on this one. Wales set to introduce a 20 miles per hour speed limit in some places, residential and busy pedestrian areas, in a bid to increase road safety and cut car use. Anyone caught speeding could theoretically face a minimum £100 fine, as well as 3 penalty points. Let's turn to the broadcaster, Danny Kelly, and editor of the Oldie. Oh, Harry's getting another go. There he is. And key point, editor of the Oldie and cyclist Harry Mount, who's here in the studio. Danny, we'll start with you. I drove in a part of London today where actually there are speed cameras, and if you do over 20, you'll be collared. So there are parts of the country where this is already happening. But I was just interested in my own words there, the idea that this is... And did I say it was something to do with the environment? Because if you're driving at 20 miles an hour, that's not the most environmental speed at which to drive.
Oh, make no mistake, there's an agenda here. And the agenda is to get motorists out of cars. I'm a used car dealer as well as a journalist and a broadcaster, and I see this as yet another attack on the cars and people who own cars. You know, if they want you to do 20 miles an hour, you could cycle quicker than 20 miles an hour. I understand why they want to get people out of cars, but your central point, your insinuation, I would suggest is correct, because to hold a manual car at a steady 20 miles an hour, you're going to have to, I would say, some people will even have it in second. Third, maybe it's natural gear selection. Fourth, you're going to start stalling the damn thing, and you're just going to have, maybe you're going to cut speed, but you're going to increase noise pollution because you'll have engines revving what's off.
And Harry, as a cyclist, would you welcome, I mean, you'll already be cycling down roads in London which have 20 miles per hour speed limits. Does it change behaviour?
No, I'm with Danny. I mean, the only reason why I'm a bicyclist is because I gave up using my car, sold my car about 15 years ago because it was pointless driving in London because you were in traffic the whole time. But the only moments there was any good and useful to have a car was late at night or any back streets where you could go. You know, I was a safe driver where you could go 30 miles an hour, and that was perfectly safe. But as Danny said, I regularly on my bike, and I'm not particularly athletic cyclist, overtake cars, and it's fine for me because I'm relatively fit, but a lot of people can't bicycle. I think it's extraordinary to limit it to such a low level.
Danny, can we challenge this assumption that seems to be inherent here, that if you get people off their car, you make using the car so pointless, you can be travelling so slow, use the bike instead, maybe walk to work instead. I just wonder how true that is. I think maybe just what happens is a lot of people stay in their cars, but their life just gets that little bit harder, their commute gets that little bit longer, the school run that little bit longer, and they turn up late for work at the school gates that much more often. It just makes life harder.
And more expensive as well, Colin. That's a big factor at the moment. Yes, I agree. I've had no one return their car to me saying, Dan, do you want to buy my car back? Because guess what? I've bought a bike. Or guess what? I'm now catching the train or the bus. That just doesn't happen. Your co-panelist there, the gentleman is right about London. I'm fortunate enough to be asked by GBNews to come down every Sunday from the Midlands, and it is... Well, it's just basically covered in average speed cameras. And just go back to the story in Wales, Colin, if I may for a moment. It's actually unpopular. One Welsh resident has actually called it an undemocratic whitewash. I've done some research into this, and again, your co-panellists will be able to confirm I would have thought. But I think it encourages road rage as well, because on a 30-mile-an-hour stretch, if I'm behind someone who's doing 20 miles an hour on a 30, and you do get them, I'll overtake them. I think that there is definitely mileage for maybe on school roads during school time. I think that's a great idea. But just to have a blanket 20-mile-an-hour speed policy, I think is madness. It costs £33 million. How they've come to that figure, I don't know. We're probably having to replace the signs with 20s, and maybe you're going to put something through people's letterboxes. It's £33 million. It's madness.
Well, if it's madness, Harry Mount, we should put our faith in elected democracy, shouldn't we? That if people really take umbrage so much, and I think Danny Kelly makes a really good point about the road rage. I've seen it happen, and if people find this so objectionable, this hasn't been introduced by a computer. It's been introduced by politicians, and if people really don't like the idea so much, vote them out.
Yes, but it's one of those policies which is you'd be quite a brave politician to say we want to raise the speed limit. It's like saying, I'd like to strangle puppy dogs, isn't it? It's, obviously, if you raise the speed limit back up to 30, more people will sadly die. So you've got to be a robust, strong politician. I thoroughly back the idea of staying at 30, but it's one of those difficult ones to fight because it sounds so virtuous, doesn't it?
Harry Mount, Danny Kelly, thanks both for your thoughts today. Let me just bring in more on that story about the Boris Johnson's decision, as it's been reported, to deny a no-confidence vote. The Reuters news agency, they're saying that Britain's government said today that it would allow an attempt by the opposition Labour Party to call a confidence vote if the wording of the motion was changed to remove references to the Prime Minister. Here's the quote. We've given Labour the option to table a straightforward vote of no confidence in the government. This is from a government spokeswoman. The quote goes on. They've chosen to play politics by tabling a vote of no confidence in the government and the Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister has already resigned and a leadership process is underway. We do not feel this is a valuable use of parliamentary time. Sorry, that's only just come in. I would have put it to Labour's opposition spokesman who was talking about this 10 minutes ago, but it's just arrived. We'll flesh that out a little bit later on. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News. Coming up, the Olympic star Sir Mo Farah has revealed that he was trafficked to the UK as a child. We'll be talking about that after the weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Very warm once again this afternoon in the south, but it has turned a bit cooler further north, although most places are fine. It's a decent sunny day for the vast majority. It is cloudier, however, compared to the last couple of days, courtesy of a cold front which has moved in. It's brought some rain to the northwest earlier on, but it's weakening all the while, and really as we head into the evening, just a few spots of rain affecting parts of Wales and the Midlands, and then most places dry overnight. 1 or 2 showers into the north of Scotland, a brisk breeze here, the cloud further south tending to break up, so some clear spells by dawn. But it's a warm night in the south, 17 to 19 Celsius, cooler further north, 11 to 13 degrees for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. Into the start of Wednesday then, warm across much of England and Wales from the word go. Plenty of sunshine, any cloud in the far south tending to break and disappear. And then blue skies for much of the day for England and Wales. A bit more cloud for Northern Ireland and Scotland. A few showers for central Scotland, northern Scotland as well. 18 Celsius for Glasgow, 20 for Belfast, but up into the mid to high 20s once again for South Wales and southern England. And that sunshine, again, will feel hot. So we keep the heat in the south, even if it does turn cooler for a few days further north. But for the vast majority, it is staying dry. And into Wednesday night, it's another relatively warm night with temperatures in the south only dipping to 15 to 17 Celsius, 11 to 13 for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. A few showers around for Northern Ireland and Northern and Western Scotland first thing Thursday. Bright skies otherwise, and plenty of sunshine for the southern half of the UK once again. And by this stage, well, things are starting to turn warmer. And by the weekend, widespread sunny skies return, and we're back up into the 30s.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Start with some emails. Lots of them coming in again. Eileen says Nadeem Zahawi should seriously be considered as Prime Minister. He's held 2 posts and made successes of both. He comes over as level-headed, a level-headed fellow, and I think he would make a good PM. Why vote for untried and untested people? Michael says, Colin, it's so obvious to me why the mainstream media wants Sunak as PM. They've already loaded the bullets to rip him to shreds. Jay says, red wall voters and many others, including me, will not vote Conservative with Sunak as PM. We see right through him. Sarah says, Kevin Badenoch is fresh, brave and not afraid to tell the truth, just like your news channel. OK, thanks. Now, the Olympic star and former long-distance runner, Sir Mo Farah, has revealed that he was brought to the UK illegally as a child and forced to work as a domestic servant. He told the BBC he was given the name Mohammed Farah and was forced to look after another family's children. Let's turn.
Most people know me as Mo Farah, but it's not my name or it's not the reality. The real story is I was born in Somaliland, north of Somalia, as Hussein Abdi Kahin.
Well, our social and cultural affairs editor is Anaya Falara Imam, who's here in the studio. This is an unexpected twist, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, the Olympic medalist Mo Farah. For many people, they understood his family story to be that he came with his mother and brothers to meet a father that was already here. And now he's revealed that that story is not the truth. Actually, his father was killed in the civil war in Somalia, and he got separated from his mother when he was quite young and trafficked to the UK on a false name. And it was only in school when his PE teacher saw his ability and he had the opportunity to actually demonstrate his ability in a national championship that it became aware that actually that wasn't his real name and he didn't have British citizenship. So his PE teacher helped him to get that. And I think it is a very fascinating story. Many people are asking why now in the kind of political context where there is many different discussions about immigration, refugees and asylum seekers and so on. But it is fascinating insofar as it has shone light on something that many people don't really know about. Nearly 1 million people in the UK are living here, are undocumented, and hundreds of thousands.
We don't really know, do we?
Oh, exactly. That's just the estimate, and it could be much more.
A really basic question: was he? How old was he when this happened? Was he aware of what? Was he part of the kind of new identity thing? Did he know it wasn't his name, or was he actually just he was trafficked and had no idea what his real name was.
No. So he did know, and I think the woman he describes in the story that was originally the one that trafficked him, he had said to his mother that that they were going to take him to be looked after in Britain, and when he, for example, had his contact details of his family, and the woman had ripped it up, then he'd realised that actually something wrong was going to be happening here. So he was, as you mentioned in the introduction, effectively trafficked as a slave in the language that he described, as being forced into indentured servitude, looking after other kids. And thankfully, there was a teacher that was able to help him and support him on that. But I'm sure that his story is resonant to thousands of other young people in this country.
Well, and, I don't want to be flippant about it, but we've just done an item talking about people coming across on flimsy boats across the Channel, where it's become, we're told, pretty routine to dispose of any identification documents you have. So this idea of it's year zero, I start again, clean slate, and yes, with a purpose to try and make it more difficult for the authorities to find out exactly who you are and process an asylum claim accordingly. I mean, we can see it in that context too, can't we?
Yeah, and it is interesting because the PE teacher in the documentary that's going to be aired later this week, they asked him whether or not he regrets it, so to speak, for example, facilitating something like this. And I think that actually, interestingly, the Home Office has said they're not going to kind of look into this. They don't hold children complicit in these kinds of affairs. But actually, the Metropolitan Police in the last hour has said they may well actually investigate some of these trafficking claims because they are incredibly serious.
Inaya, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Thanks a lot. It's just gone 5 o'clock. And coming up, 6 p.m, it's the moment of truth for several Tory prime ministerial wannabes. It's the deadline for candidates to secure the backing of 20 fellow MPs. We'll be telling you who's in and who's out. We might start hearing some whispers this hour. Also, Labour's today been pushing for a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson's government. We've just heard they won't get their way. We'll be talking about that, and in a series of mind-blowing firsts, the most powerful telescope ever launched into space has beamed back our first glimpse of the dawn of the universe. Alongside me for the next hour, the editor of the Oldie, Harry Mount. But first, we've got the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The latest headlines this hour. Pressure is on Tory candidates then to secure enough nominations to formally enter the race to replace Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, confirming she won't be standing. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, also saying he won't be standing, but he's given his support to the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. That leaves 10 contenders now who need the support, as Colin was saying, of 20 MPs by 6 p.m. today. 3 have officially launched campaigns today with speeches, and tax policy has been central. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak said he would lower the tax burden, but only when inflation has been brought under control.
My message to the party and the country is simple. I have a plan to steer our economy through these headwinds. We need a return to traditional Conservative economic values, and that means honesty and responsibility, not fairy tales.
Well, a prominent Tory backbencher, Tom Tugendhat, is promising to provide a new sense of direction to the party.
We need leadership with a renewed sense of mission. Leadership that sees beyond divisive politics and delivers results. Leadership that will return government to the service of our economy, our people, and our country. We need a clean start.
Well, the former Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, launched her campaign by saying her focus would be on the truth.
Governing involves trade-offs, and we need to start being honest about that. Unlike others, I'm not going to promise you things without a plan to deliver them. People are sick of that. They're crying out for honesty.
Well, the government says it's going to allow a debate on Labour's confidence vote to go ahead if they amend their motion to remove any reference to the Prime Minister. That comes after Labour's initial motion for a vote of confidence of the Prime Minister was denied. The Labour parties accused the government of running scared and called on Tory leadership candidates to denounce the decision. A government spokesperson said a vote in the Prime Minister would be a waste of parliamentary time, as he's already resigned. In news away from home, Japan has said goodbye to the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated last week. Amid a heavy police presence, close family and friends of Japan's longest-serving premier attended a private funeral service in Tokyo. Abe was shot when he was making a speech at a campaign event last week. After the ceremony, a hearse carrying the body was accompanied by police on a procession through the city. Here, Heathrow Airport has introduced a cap on the number of daily passengers to pass through its terminals. The measure's been introduced as the airline industry struggles to deal with demand. Between July and September, no more than 100,000 passengers will be able to go through the airport in West London. And more than 1,000 people have now crossed the English Channel, less than a week after an international operation to disrupt a people smuggling network. Yesterday, 442 people were pulled off 25 small boats as they tried to make their way to the UK. And today, more than 100 have made the crossing, with operations still ongoing to intercept small boats in the Channel. Last Wednesday, the UK's National Crime Agency said crossings were expected to fall following the arrest of 39 people believed to be part of a criminal gang. Her Majesty the Queen has presented the George Cross to the NHS in a ceremony at Windsor Castle. The monarch and Prince Charles welcomed NHS bosses and a frontline worker from each of the UK's 4 nations. The award recognises acts of great heroism and courage in the face of extreme danger. And NASA has unveiled the first pictures taken by its new James Webb Telescope. The $9 billion machine's expected to revolutionise astronomy by allowing scientists to peer farther into the universe than ever before and with greater clarity. NASA says its high-resolution pictures will allow scientists to observe the evolution of galaxies and the life cycles of all stars. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Minutes past 5. In the next hour, it will be the moment of truth for several Tory prime ministerial wannabes. 6 p.m. marks the deadline for candidates to secure the backing of 20 fellow MPs. If they don't, they're out. It's as brutal as that. This afternoon, the shape of the looming contest really did begin to take shape. There are currently, as far as we can tell, 4 candidates who we know have reached the threshold of 20 MPs. They are Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, Tom Tugendhat and Liz Truss. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, threw in the towel and threw in his lot with Rishi Sunak, as did Matt Hancock. Priti Patel decided not to run. And we also saw the frontrunners holding official campaign launches, amongst them the early pacemaker and current bookies' favourite, former Chancellor Rishi Sunak.
I will have no part in a rewriting of history that seeks to demonise Boris, exaggerate his faults or deny his efforts.
Well, Tom Tugendhat drew on his military career when asked about his lack of ministerial experience.
This is no time to learn. What this is a time to look at a record of service, a record of delivery, under the most difficult and trying conditions around the world, and to see that this isn't learning on the job. This is putting all that experience to work on the job, and the best job and the hardest job in the United Kingdom.
Well, Kemi Badenoch, the former Equalities Minister, said that while she will cut taxes if elected leader, she didn't want to compete with other leaders to make the biggest cuts.
But I will not enter into a tax bidding war over my tax cuts are bigger than yours. To make promises that you cannot keep is a betrayal of everything that I stand for.
Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, is my studio guest today. We've just been joined by Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, busiest man in the building. Any news this hour?
Well, we've got 5 now over the 20. Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, has just announced
you predicted that. Well done, Dan.
Has handed in her nomination papers, so she will officially be on that ballot tomorrow. We have got, an hour to go. Is Jeremy Hunt going to be on that? Is Sajid Javid going to be on the ballot? Is Nadeem Zahawi, the current Chancellor, going to be on the ballot? I don't know. I don't think so. Not all of them are, I don't think. Nadeem Zahawi may well get over the line. I think the big question is, though, about Jeremy Hunt and Sajid Javid, which is quite surprising, given the fact that Sajid Javid, of course, was the first man to resign. He's had a pretty effective speech after PMQs last week. Jeremy Hunt, of course, finished second, didn't he, last time round? Would have thought he would have done better. But it is interesting, isn't it, that actually some of these outsiders, some of these names that we've not really known about, have done quite well. Tom Tugendhat is the perfect example of that. You know, he's someone who's not even ever been in government. And there is this sense within the Conservative Party at the moment. Yes, of course, Rishi's doing very well and Liz Truss is doing pretty well, but also there's a real desire among some MPs for a clean slate to try and get someone who is not associated with this government, with this Prime Minister that closely. And that is why I think that we're seeing people like Suella Braverman and Femi Badenoch managing, and Tom Tugendhat, to do so well in this campaign so far.
These are politicians, Darren. They will have plans. That's what they do. They plan things. And if you're Jeremy Hunt, you will have a plan for 6 o'clock in 50 minutes' time. If you haven't got 20 MPs so that you can join this contest, you're still Jeremy Hunt. You still count for something. You've got, I don't know, let's say he's got 15 MPs who've backed him. Does he now say to them, guys, gals, you now back Rishi Sunak? Because if you do that, I'll be in good odour with the future Prime Minister and I get a nice job.
Indeed. And also, if you come with me, you know, I'm not going to forget that. And if I'm Secretary of State for Health again or whatever it is, you know, I may want you on my ministerial team. Yes, of course, that is how politics works. Patronage is incredibly powerful in politics. It's one of the strongest kind of weapons or tools or instruments that ministers and Prime Ministers have. In saying that, it is also clear, though, that you know, MPs also have minds of their own, and it's not necessarily always the case. Grant Shapp's been a very good example today, who's come out and backed Rishi Sunak, but not all the MPs who were originally backing him have followed suit. Paul Bristow, for example, has gone and backed Liz Truss rather than Rishi Sunak. And that's what makes this really, really, actually incredibly difficult to predict. And you know, this is a political game. It will get to a point, and we saw this, actually, in 2019, where Boris Johnson was so far ahead in terms of the number of MPs, he was actually lending votes, telling some of his supporters, literally tapping them on the shoulder, giving them a bit of an elbow and saying, actually, can you go and back that Rory Stewart, because I want to split the votes with Jeremy Hunt on my opponent's side. So there's an awful lot of horse trading, and you're right, we're down to the final hour now of who's only going to be in the first round, and there'll be a lot of politics at the Westminster about where those MPs are going to break.
I'm going to bring Harry Mount in just a second, but before I do that, Darren, just ponder on this one. Are you surprised, because I think I am a little bit, how little fresh ideological thinking has been brought to bear? I mean, I know there's been a lot of tussling about tax cuts, and Priti Patel, who's not standing, said, let's seriously get fracking. There's been a couple of ideas. Nadeem Zahawi with some ideas around crime, saying that anybody who's a convicted drug dealer should have their driving licence removed. But there's been so few of them that those two stand out to me.
Yeah, indeed. And I put this to, you know, a supporter of Tom Tugendhat a little bit earlier on today. He's meant to be the clean start or the fresh start as he brands himself. And yet, you know, he's largely on the same page as most of them that want to see a bit of a tax cut at some point in the future, supports the Rwanda plan with immigration, supports the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's like, well, it doesn't sound like a fresh start, so it's entirely consistent with what the government's been doing for the last 2 and a bit years. You know, let's be honest about this. The Conservative Party have been in government for, nigh on 13 years almost now. And at that stage, it does become incredibly difficult for parties to try and think of new policies and new ideas and new ways out of that. And you're right, even though there is a very diverse field of candidates, quite an eclectic mix from different wings of the party, in terms of actual fundamental changes, there's a real lacking of that. And maybe that's impossible when you've been in government for so long, when you've been in a party that's been in government for so long, to actually revolutionise that from within inside government. possibly is such a big ask, it's impossible.
You might, Darren, hang around for this question, only if you want to, which is for Harry Mounters.
I do need to get to Westminster for 6, but
you might be surprised by what you're about to hear, and I'm putting it to Harry Mounters, editor of The Oldie. I don't know what the average age of the candidates is. A lot of them are in their 40s. The greybeards in this election, the Zahawis, the Hunts, they're in their mid-50s. Compare and contrast to American presidential elections where you're still in nappies in your 60s and you hit your straps in your 70s.
And also another point on that front is it's the weirdest election of all, isn't it? The Tory election, as it has been for 20 years, is you've got to appeal to two constituencies. You've got to win among the MPs and then slightly pivot sometimes and appeal to the members. And the members are that much older. So they're having to appeal to two groups at the same time. I remember I was at the Telegraph 20 years ago and everyone always thought that Ken Clarke or Michael Portillo would become Tory leader because they were the photogenic popular ones. But actually among the members, they weren't because they were Europhiles, and Ian Duncan-Smith and Michael Howard won, and more recently Boris did. I wonder whether that's going to change this time. We're going to be 6 years since the Brexit vote, whether a Remainer, an original Remainer like Rishi Sunak might actually win.
Well, just to add on the experience thing, because it does get slightly dismissed, and I don't think it should do with the supporters of Badenoch or of Tom Tugendhat or others, that actually being in government doesn't really matter that much. But I'd argue that it does, because at the end of the day, you know, this is not like 1997 or 2001 or 2003 when you're becoming leader of the opposition and you've got time to formulate ideas and you're up against the Prime Minister at question time. You were literally coming into the role of Prime Minister at a time in which we've got a huge economic crisis and actually a very short time for the Conservative Party to turn things around, potentially ahead of a pretty imminent general election. I think it's a massive step up. If you've not been a government minister, to suddenly become Prime Minister, that's a big ask, I think, of anyone, no matter how capable they or their supporters think they are.
So you got sucked in, didn't you, in the end? You had to run, but you got sucked in.
I'm going now.
Darren, thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
The Labour Party said it wanted to push for a no-confidence vote in the government after Boris Johnson's downfall, but within the last hour or thereabouts, it was reported that Boris Johnson had blocked that vote of no confidence. And another, but because in the last 15 minutes there's another twist too, the government says that it would allow a vote of no confidence if the wording of the motion was changed to remove reference to the Prime Minister, to Boris Johnson. If you're confused, that's you and me both. Let's turn to Rafe Hadel-Manku, royal broadcaster and constitutional analyst as well. Rafe, welcome to you. Will we get a vote of no confidence vote? Not entirely clear. I think that's probably a reasonable thing to say at this stage. The wording may be TBC. But just on the point that we were discussing an hour or so ago, if the opposition wants to hit the nuclear button and bring down a government, is there not an argument for writing that into a constitution? It does seem odd that a Prime Minister of the day can set his or her face against it.
Well, these things are constitutional conventions, and we don't have a written constitution. And it's important that, you know, these are often called conventions are the moonbeams that bind our constitution, and in many ways explain why our constitution remains the world's longest and oldest continuous constitution. Now, the reason that the Prime Minister was able to block this motion was because it specifically mentioned the Prime Minister, and any motion of no confidence in a minister or a Prime Minister can be vetoed, and the Labour Party will be forced to put it forward only on an opposition day. But a motion of no confidence in the government specifically is always complied with within a matter of days. So in 2019, for example, under Theresa May, that vote of no confidence came the very next day after it was requested. But, you know, votes of no confidence, there's a long history of them being in British history, not only here. Yesterday, for example, in France, Emmanuel Macron survived a vote of no confidence. Tomorrow, there's a vote of no confidence in the Irish Parliament in the Dáil in the Republic tomorrow evening. They're quite rare in the 21st century. Theresa May has been the only one in the 21st century. But, you know, John Major faced 6 of them, I think. Same thing with Thatcher. But Callaghan, of course, lost his vote of no confidence, bringing Margaret Thatcher into power when a general election was called, there have only been 3 times in the last century that votes of no confidence have actually passed.
Rafe Hadelman-Koo, we've got some breaking news, but thanks as ever for your analysis there, Rafe. Thanks a lot. The Press Association, our colleagues there, are reporting that the Telford inquiry into those grooming gangs there over the years, more than 1,000 children were sexually exploited over 3 decades in Telford amid what have been described by this inquiry as shocking police and council failings. They say that unnecessary suffering and even deaths of children might have been avoided had West Mercia Police, quote, done its most basic job in acting on reports of these grooming gangs and sexual exploitation. You may be one of those people, I certainly am, who finds inquiries like this too inclined to blame the authorities and not inclined enough to blame the perpetrators. Talk about that some other time, shall we? Now, more than 1,000 people have crossed the Channel, the English Channel, in less than a week. That figure made life difficult for the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, who was grilled by MPs this afternoon on the use of the Army and Navy to counter migrant crossings.
Since defence took primacy, only 1 migrant boat has landed in the UK in an uncontrolled way. And we define uncontrolled as in we were not physically escorting it or we hadn't intercepted it and cross-decked people at sea. And even the boat that arrived in what we would describe as an uncontrolled way landed in the vicinity of Dungeness Power Station, and the nuclear civil police were able to intercept them.
So that really sounds impressive. It sounds like you've got the channel under control.
Tobias, you're not going to tempt me to say such grand things, because I just think a run of still days, would test us. Of course, it would.
Let's turn to the editor of the Oldie, Harry Mount, who's alongside me today. Harry, when you hear the Armed Forces Minister there bluntly point out a really obvious thing, that people in boats about whom we know absolutely nothing, their intentions may be entirely benign, we just don't know, arriving in boats next to a nuclear power station, you have to stop and think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've discussed this before, haven't we? That actually, particularly, I don't mean to be flippant, but on extraordinary sunny, good weather like this, it is actually physically very easy to turn people back, isn't it? It's just the legal and the political will aren't there. I think actually largely the popular will probably is, and certainly among Tory party prospective leaders, the will is there. But the political and legal will is against it at the moment. But it would be very simple, as we've discussed before, like they did in Australia, to turn people back.
OK. Harry, for now, thanks very much indeed. We'll be talking to Stephen Wolfe, a regular contributor on this topic, very shortly. Oh, in fact, I'm told he's ready to talk to us, if only somebody told me that. Stephen Wolfe, Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, joins us now. Hi to you, Stephen. Just on that point about people landing, migrants landing in these boats near the nuclear reactor at Dungeness, I mean, that, as the Armed Forces Minister was making clear there, I mean, obviously, the vast bulk of these, the migrants are well-intentioned in the sense they're seeking a better life and sometimes escaping persecution, as refugee charities make clear. But we just don't know who they are.
No, we don't know who they are. And I think what was very important about the intervention from Mo Farah yesterday is that it confirms what many of us have said, that the traffickers are using people when they're bringing them over on these boats into the United Kingdom for reasons other than just asylum. They're bringing them in the case of Mo Farah, for slavery. We know that there are those who are a danger to our nation, and the police and our security services have been monitoring them, hence the reason that we wanted to put tagging on them. So the arrivals that we have indicate that there are still potential dangers to them. We're grateful, obviously, as Tobias L was raised to the Defence Minister, that the police that's connected with the security of Dungeness were able to apprehend them. But what would happen if they didn't and there were nefarious individuals on them? It's an opportunity for why we need to be certain about who these people are.
Are you not struck, as I am, and maybe many of our viewers and listeners will be too, in the course of the last few days and this Conservative leadership election that it's become an article of faith now, almost can't be challenged, the idea of a policy which has been challenged, and some in the mainstream media, the idea of the Rwanda policy, which I know you've been a cheerleader for, but every single person who wants to be the next leader of the Conservative Party is saying, yes, I'll stand by it.
Well, it's politically essential for those leaders who want to attract the Conservative voters across the country who support stronger control of our borders and see the Rwanda policy as essential in that strong control. It's also essential for those leaders to be able to be seen to be tough on the migration issue, because there is a clear north-south divide in the Conservative voters. At a recent local government association meeting of Conservative councillors, they were deeply concerned about the results, seeing the Liberal Democrats win in Tiverton and Amersham. And for them, the key was to reduce taxation. And they didn't seem to be overly concerned about the red wall voters who see the cost of living and immigration as the biggest issue. And that is why I think that these leaders, if they're going to be successful and get past the post once it becomes the votes of the membership, need to be strong in immigration, because the northern voters in the Conservative Party will definitely be selecting only those who are strong on this issue.
Stephen Wolfe, as ever. Stephen, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. We're going to move on to a breaking news story. We've been talking a lot about politics, and here's a story, and the politics gets well covered, but here's a story which over the years has been to a great degree ignored, perhaps because a lot of the victims are the people who are least likely to gain attention and understanding from other people in positions of authority. You'll be familiar with the names of Rotherham, of Rochdale, perhaps less so with Telford. But Telford today, the subject of a really shocking inquiry looking back at 30 years of grooming by gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage originally. More than 1,000 children were sexually exploited over at least 30 years in Telford, amid what this inquiry is described as a shocking police and council failings. I'll just give you a couple of quotes from Tom Crowther, QC, the QC, who's been the chairman of this inquiry. He says the overwhelming theme of the evidence has been the appalling suffering of generations of children caused by the utter cruelty of those who committed child sexual exploitation. Victims and survivors repeatedly told the inquiry how when they were children, adult men worked to gain their trust before ruthlessly betraying that trust, treating them as sexual objects or commodities. They lived in fear and their lives were forever changed. The inquiry into 30 years of abuse in Telford, described today as absolutely shocking. We're going to talk to somebody who can give us a view on this that's not necessarily widely shared. That is Samantha Smith, the writer and columnist who joins me. Samantha, you yourself were a victim of child sexual abuse and grooming in Telford, not connected to the cases here, I understand. You experienced firsthand the lack of attention, inactivity of the local authority. Tell us more.
Yes, I've just been reading through the reports as you have. It came out at 5 p.m. I spent the last 10 minutes crying in the middle of the town centre, reading through really what victims have known for decades, what victims have known all along, which is that the police, social services, local authorities, local council turned a blind eye to, blamed and frankly ignored victims of child sexual exploitation, child sex crimes in Telford. Generations of girls have been affected by this crime and continue to be affected. As recently as 2020, the local authority was still receiving hundreds of reports of potential child exploitation in Telford. You know, at the time, the previous chief superintendent of West Mercia Police said that the Daily Mirror's estimation that up to 1,000 girls had been abused in Telford was wildly exaggerated, and that he didn't believe that there was a discernible problem with child sexual exploitation in Telford. But today's report blows his words out of the water. It shows that police, council, social services not only turned a blind eye to, but blamed the girls for the abuse that they suffered. I remember when I first talked to my social worker about some of the abuse that I experienced, I was asked, if you were physically abused, why were there no bruises? And my police officer from the CSE team that handled my case, when I finally spoke up about it, they decided to take no further action and instead had a stern conversation with one of my abusers, which really, in my opinion, sums up all I have to say about the issue.
Wow. I mean, Samantha, you know, your bitter experience in this area can't be gainsaid. That goes without saying. I just wonder, to those viewers and listeners of ours who look at this and, you know, they were familiar with that roll call, that litany of cities and towns. My hometown of Bradford was one of them, Rochdale, Oldham, Rotherham. But they didn't expect, rightly or wrongly, someone like Telford. When people thought of Telford, they thought of a sleepy, almost rustic town. They didn't expect it to be the place where something as grim as this was happening. You see what I'm saying, don't you? I mean, obviously, it's based on people's misunderstanding, but it didn't fit into the pattern.
I think because Telford is in leafy...
Let's try and fix that line. If we do that, she was just coming back. Samantha, carry on. Let's go to Peter Blexley, former Metropolitan Police detective who's been a commentator on this subject for some time and many others too. Peter Blexley, welcome to you. I was going to make the point how the technology stood the test to Samantha Smith there, who's a victim turned campaigner. That there's a danger sometimes it will feel to many people, it certainly does to me, that in blaming the council, in blaming former colleagues of yours nationally in the police force, we run the risk sometimes of forgetting that there were perpetrators here.
Yes, I think we do. And I want to see these perpetrators arrested, charged, and if sufficient evidence is there, I want to see them convicted. But beyond that, yes, we've had this inquiry and the findings, of course, are shocking and shameful. But I want those responsible in positions of authority to be investigated. And if evidence can be found to support charges perhaps of misconduct in public office, because doing nothing is misconduct, or even disciplinary charges that might apply to those who are still serving, I want to see accountability. Like yourself, all those names of those towns that you've mentioned sicken me. I want accountability. I want to see not only perpetrators, but those who allowed it to happen in the dock as well.
Blexley, just hold that thought, if you would. I just wanted to bring in Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, but also a journalist of many years standing who's with me here in the studio. And, Harry, I want to ponder on this point, really, that this is one of those stories that lots of people have brushed under the carpet, and that's why we're talking about the Telford inquiry right now, with an astonishing number of young victims. But actually, I can think back to the interventions of a Labour MP, as was Anne Cryer, interviewing her on a couple of occasions about this way back when. And then she was denounced, including by Labour backbench colleagues, as a racist for even bringing it up, because a lot of the grooming gangs predominantly were of Pakistani heritage. I think back to the interventions of Andrew Norfolk, formerly of the Yorkshire Post, then the Times, as a journalist, and Maggie Oliver, the detective in, I think in Rochdale, wasn't it, who became a whistleblower. It took individuals, just a handful of individuals, to turn the tide on this, and it ought not to have done.
No, and actually the really good thing is that we can talk about these horrifying things now, and there's no danger of any of us being called a racist. That row is over. But the extraordinary thing, I thought your interviewee, Samantha, was extremely moving, and her testimony obviously completely convincing. And it's extraordinary that someone like that, a child, but also a highly intelligent child, would go and complain and should be largely ignored. Because, as you know, on the whole, poor children who are abused stay quiet. So the tendency should be to very much to believe them and certainly to investigate it. So it's extraordinary that they weren't investigated.
Peter Blexley, as a former Metropolitan Police detective, what do you make of those reports suggesting that this isn't a historical problem, it remains a problem?
If that is the case, then it is absolutely scandalous, deeply, deeply concerning, and something that needs to be addressed immediately on behalf of the victims, like your courageous contributor, Samantha, and many, many hundreds more, if they are still being trafficked, abused, raped, and many other crimes. It's a central tenet of policing that what policing is carried out without fear or favour. That clearly broke down in so many of, in this case and many others, because they were fearful of causing tensions within the Asian community. That was the finding once again in this Telford inquiry. It is shocking, it is appalling, and those who carry a warrant card simply shouldn't have one if they cannot carry out policing without fear or favour.
Thank you. And move on and move back to Samantha Smith, the writer and columnist who joins me, who, as a child, was a victim of child sexual abuse and grooming in Telford. Samantha, apologies for the technical problems, but I appreciate you coming back to talk to us about this. You were saying very emotionally that you're glad this investigation is finished. How surprised should people be by the findings? It feels like we've heard this before again and again.
You're right in the fact that it's the same old story. Police failings, council failings, a cover-up culture, victim blaming, passing children off as child prostitutes or madams or troublemakers or white slags, as was said on Mark Stein's show yesterday. Police in areas like Telford, frankly, couldn't care less about victims, about the young girls that were methodically raped, abused and exploited by gangs in Telford, because they didn't have anyone to fight their corner or to defend them. It was far easier to blame the victims than to go after the perpetrators, as I experienced in my own case and as many survivors of CSE have experienced over the many decades that this has been going on in my area.
Samantha Smith, I was just, while you were trying to fix the technical gremlins, I was remembering interviews I did 20 years ago with a Labour MP, Anne Cryer, Keighley MP, and she was saying then that this was a problem. She'd identified a problem in her constituency, young, predominantly Pakistani heritage men. And in trying to draw attention to that, these grooming gangs, she was ostracised and denounced as a racist, even by members of her own party. Was that the reason why it was brushed under the carpet, do you think? Well, the independent report into CSE in Telford identified in no uncertain terms that police didn't investigate potential cases of CSE over quote-unquote nervousness about race. Frankly, these are predominantly white working class girls being abused on council estates, in kebab shops, in taxis, and it's once again far easier to blame the victims, to say that they wanted it or that it was their own promiscuity that caused the abuse, rather than have those difficult conversations about the makeup of the perpetrators and the fact that predominantly these are Pakistani men going after young, defenceless children. Is it still going on, Sam? Well, as recently as 2020, like I said, there were hundreds of potential child sexual exploitation cases being referred to West Mercia Police. That's also in the report. I believe it was 271 that were referred to West Mercia Police. As recently as 2019, nationwide, it was 17,800, I believe, cases of potential CSE that were reported in towns and cities like Telford. This isn't a problem that's gone away, and they can parrot the same old lines, the Council of Police and Social Services can, that, that lessons have been learned and these are mistakes of the past. But no, girls on the ground in areas like Telford know all too well that the culture of victim blaming, of ignorance, silence and shame perpetrated by those that are meant to protect young girls hasn't gone away, and that lessons won't be learned until serious changes happen from the top. There needs to be accountability from those in the highest levels of office, both former and current, and recognition that they failed girls, they continue to fail girls, and they need to take serious substantive measures in order to change the way that they deal with victims and perpetrators in CSE cases. Well, no, I don't know, but I mean, I do know that a substantial number of the victims were in care. I don't know whether they amount to a majority of the victims, but I do know that the number of kids in care in Britain is rocketing at the moment. The social services, for whatever reason, well, we know some of the high-profile cases of abuse by parents and guardians, and when that happens, the pendulum swings. social services less inclined to leave vulnerable children in the care of their parents, put them into a care home. And that's fine up to a point, but we know from the data that the outcomes in care homes can often be pretty lousy. And we know that many of the victims, and I'm sure you'll know whether it's a majority of the victims, were in care when they were abused.
What I know is that the girls that fall victim to crimes like CSE, Telford is, by the way, the child sex crime capital of the UK. The rate of child sex crimes in Telford is over double that of the national rate. Nationally, it's 7.9 per 10,000. In Telford, it's 16.4 per 10,000, and that's with a population of around 160,000. Telford is a very small town, so for sex crimes to be happening on such an industrial scale in our town speaks to there being a deep-rooted problem across all authorities that are supposed to protect children. I was under social services from the age of 15. I flitted out in and out of different supported accommodations, children's home, etc., etc. And I definitely felt that vulnerable children were ignored and almost seen as problem cases waiting to happen, criminals in waiting. We were treated as though we had no real prospects, and it was a case of trying to keep us out of jail rather than help us to aspire to succeed beyond our status in life. I think that's what makes girls in areas like Telford so easily preyed upon, is because they are already vulnerable. They don't have the traditional support networks that those from middle class or upper class families would have, and therefore when they fall victim, they once again don't have those around them to defend them, and it's easier for councils and local authorities to sweep them under the rug.
Samantha Smith, campaigner and columnist and contributor here. We appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mounts, the editor of The Oldie, who's alongside me. Any thoughts on this?
All I could say is she is utterly dazzling and highly intelligent and incredibly convincing, extraordinary that somebody like her, or amazing to think 1,000 children, some or others, part of them didn't complain, but I bet loads did, and that it's taken so long, you say 30 years. Some of these people are presumably now in their 40s. It is a staggering scandal.
It really is. Scandal's the right word. Harry Mount, thanks very much indeed. And much more news coming up here, including the number of COVID cases increasing. Would you be prepared to wear a mask again? We'll be discussing that after the news.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
The Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla, speaks frankly about her life in the royal limelight in an ITV documentary that is scheduled to be broadcast, I think, tomorrow night. The programme marks her 75th birthday at the weekend and also her guest editorship of Country Life magazine, the cover of which features a portrait taken by her daughter-in-law, the Duchess of Cambridge. The photo, it was snapped in the gardens of Charles's Hightree House. We're joined by the royal biographer, Angela Levin, who has just written a book about Camilla. And Angela, I know you had lots of, is it fair to say, authorised sources? So it's not you just writing off the top of your head. It was well informed.
No, I'm not writing off the top of my head. I couldn't do that.
and you came away with what impression of this woman who, hopefully, in time, will be our queen?
Can I just say the photographs were taken at Raymill House, which is Camilla's own property, which she got just after she divorced from her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles.
You can.
So just to do that. I first met her in 2015, and I was astonished by her warmth and by the way she could deal with rape victims. I was asked if I'd like to spend the day with her going around rape victims in hiding. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be so embarrassing. But actually, she broke the ice absolutely brilliantly. And the girls who weren't interested in seeing her before she arrived, because as a journalist, you go earlier than the actual royal. Afterwards, when I went to speak to them, they said, she's done more good to me than a whole year of therapy. She's got an extraordinary knack of really showing deep interest with a mischievous eye and a laugh. It's an extraordinary combination, but it works terribly well. And people do warm to her and tell her things. And she loves to know people's stories. One of the things was when she was very keen on literacy, and she wanted to go to places where it was very hard, where families were difficult and children weren't read to and all that. And the CEO said to me, she'll go straight to people who she thinks needs her most. And she did that. I mean, she's got an extraordinary antennae. And I suppose that's why she stayed with Charles so long, because from the beginning, she had the antennae that he was the one, but the timing wasn't right. And it obviously fell apart. And he had this arranged marriage with Diana, really. With the two grandmas.
By the way of putting it, but it sort of feels quite true, doesn't it? Angela, we didn't realise when we invited you on that Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, would have a Camilla scoop, which is worth reprising for anybody who didn't watch the last hour.
Well, it's very kind of you, Colin, but I've just come from an Oldie lunch to celebrate Camilla's 75th birthday, and I completely agree with you, Angela. She's very funny and chatty. She said to me, "You're far too young to be editor of The Oldie. We must put up a high chair for you at lunch today." It was obviously very flattering. But she did. She gave a very funny, light speech, but in it, she very subtly, I think, gave the first indication of how she'll behave as Queen. If you don't mind me looking at my phone, because I won't remember it off by heart. She said, she was emulating the Duke of Edinburgh, and she said, the Duke of Edinburgh's philosophy was clear: look up and look out, say less, do more, and get on with the job. And that is just what I intend to do. So that doesn't seem that remarkable, but actually it's a very subtle way of saying business as usual. And actually she is a modest, diffident woman. She realised huge job coming her way. That's the first time I think she said, I'm acknowledging, as the Queen said last year, I'm going to be Queen and I won't frighten the horses.
Yes.
Say less, do more. What about Charles?
But she does that, actually. She does an awful amount behind the scenes. I was told a load of things where she helped people and bought them courses or gave them opportunities without anybody noticing. Just really kind because she thought it was needed. And I think it's very interesting because at 75, a lot of women are not doing anything very much. So she's a role model to prove that actually you're not finished when you're 50, you're not finished when you're 60 or even 75. If you want to carry on, you can, and you do. And it seems to me that the more she works, the more she enjoys it, and the more she wants to do.
And just on the point about age, we were saying an hour ago that the average age of the people who want to be the next Prime Minister is early 50s, if that. And, you know, therefore, that experience you get in the weekly audience with the monarch, given that the monarch, whether it's the Queen or whether Prince Charles, who's going to be 30 years older than some of them, you can see why that has value within a constitutional monarchy, can't you?
Well, it does have value. I know that a lot of people would like her swept away because she's too old and have been very rude about a few wrinkles she has, which doesn't mind wrinkles. It's part of ageing, and being rude about Prince Charles. But she's actually done it that you can learn more. You do know how to keep your temper. You do know you've got more experience and all those things which are incredibly valuable. I think she really enjoyed doing the country life thing as well, very much so.
We're looking forward to your book. When's it out?
The date hasn't been quite fixed, but it's now with the publishers, so it won't be long.
Nearly there.
Yes.
Thanks for coming in, really appreciate it. We're going to talk about the heatwave in just a second, but first let me just recap, if you are just tuning in, about that news from the Telford inquiry. Really grim story, but really important story too. It's found, or the QC, who was in charge of this inquiry into grooming gangs, predominantly Pakistani heritage men in the Telford area, more than 1,000 children sexually exploited over at least 30 years in Telford amid what was described as shocking police and council failings, according to that inquiry, which said that unnecessary suffering and even deaths of children might have been avoided had West Mercia Police done what was described in the inquiry, by the inquiry, as its most basic job. I'm sure Michelle Dewberry will be doing more on that story in the next hour or so stay tuned. The Met Office has issued a rare extreme heat warning for parts of England and Wales. Temperatures set to rise. Ministers devising plans for the first national heatwave emergency. Senior officials held a crisis COBRA meeting. Forecasters predicting temperatures would break the record for Britain's hottest day, Sunday, if you're marking your card for the really hot weather. We're joined by the weather forecaster, John Ketley. John, welcome to you. I was looking on Twitter today. Some people were looking at the COBRA meeting and saying, guys, it's just summer.
And that's what I would normally say, Colin, as you know. That's what I would normally say. But I think the computer modelers have been meddling in this system or something, and it's going into freefall. The trouble is there's still a little bit of inconsistency with the different models and what's happening a few days out. But there's been a certain amount of consistency, certainly, that there is hotter weather coming back over the weekend through Sunday into the start of next week. It's all about the numbers game eventually, but there is a very, very high risk, certainly, that we could beat the record, yeah.
In terms of how we deal with it as a people, as a society, do we have to dismiss that view that I just articulated, that it's just weather? I mean, if you are up to 35 degrees, if that's really what we get to on Sunday, we can't remember, can we, temperatures that high?
Well, the trouble is that the body cannot tell you what the temperature is. It's a very poor thermometer, is the body. So for some people, 35 probably feels like 30, and for others, it feels like 45. What I have to say, though, Colin, is I think 35 could be relatively modest for some parts of the south and east of England, especially. I think we could be looking at figures way above 35 degrees if this computer system is up and running properly. And we could be looking towards 40 degrees, and that's the real issue for me. I've never seen anything like this before, I have to say. I am very concerned, and I'm not a ramper. I don't ramp about extreme weather particularly. I'm more used to the normal British summer weather, as you talk about. But there is certainly a very high risk this time that Sunday to Tuesday we could be seeing temperatures up around 40 degrees in some parts, and that is extreme. That's pretty awful. I mean, today we've got temperatures of 42 in Seville, in southern Spain. They're more used to it, of course, down in Spain and France. It's 38 in France, in Carcassonne. But this hotter weather is still coming north. It hasn't happened yet. It's still coming north out of southwest Europe, and it will continue to feed further north through Friday and Saturday and then into Sunday, as you say. So it's Sunday, Monday, and maybe Tuesday as well in some parts of the southeast, where we'll see these really close to record-breaking temperatures. It is a bit of a concern.
Yeah, and just a brief thought, Don, is there anything that's happening that's unusual? I mean, it's obviously unusual, but in terms of the meteorological processes that have got us here, is there anything that's caught your eye that we ought to be aware of?
You wouldn't have thought so. I mean, looking at the models day by day, which I do, It's been a fairly average, mundane start to summer, really. We haven't seen anything too extreme. We saw 32.7 on the 17th of June, and June overall was fairly ordinary. It was fairly uneventful. Now, we've seen a few hot days recently, but Scotland has stayed pretty cool on the whole. Last couple of days have been warmer, but Scotland's had more rain and fairly unexceptional by a long way. It's been pretty boring, ordinary weather, really, for British summer. But if you look at the models every day, you can start to see something a little bit strange out to the northwest of Portugal, where there seems to be some sort of dipping of cooler air, and I'm talking about relatively cooler air, coming down towards northwestern parts of Iberia. And the result of that is to push hotter air up to the eastern side of Spain and into France. Now, that's a little bit unusual, I have to say. And the more extreme that push, the more likely you are to see these record temperatures and a big surge of heat coming out of Spain and up through France. So that's a little bit unusual. That's the sort of thing that's going to bring weather, which is going to be unusual for this part of the country.
Yeah, it'd be nice just to... I'm one of those who just wants to stay indoors Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, as you describe it. John Ketley, thanks so much, as ever. Really good to talk to you. Michelle Dewberry is going to tell you what's coming up on her show right now.
Yes, hello, Colin. Of course, 6 o'clock is not just the start of Jubes & Co, but it was the deadline for the MPs to get their nominations in for this whole leadership competition. So we'll be looking at that. Who's likely to be on the slate there? Who should be the next leader of this country? It feels so strange saying that, because many of my viewers will say it should still have been Boris Johnson. Also, we'll be picking up on that Telford story that you've just been discussing, Colin. Yet another day, yet another report. Looking backwards, of course, as these reports always do. But, you know, some of this stuff is still happening in this country. So are the measures that keep getting discussed enough to stop it? That's what I want to know. And COVID, you know, there's calls for masks to return. Many say that they should never have gone away in the first place, but they're coming back in places like some hospitals. So I want to know, is it time for a return to the mask? I certainly say no, but I'm interested for sure in what my panel think. I think we've got a couple of different mixed views there. Lawrence Fox is one of my panellists and Kevin Craig, the other one. So looking forward to that.
Oh, return to masks. Heavens above. Michelle Dewberry, looking forward to that. Thanks very much indeed. 6 o'clock. The nominations closed for the Tory party leadership. Our thanks to Harry Mount, who's been my studio guest today. Much more news coming up. Do stay with us here on GB News.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Very warm once again this afternoon in the south, but it has turned a bit cooler further north, although most places are fine. It's a decent sunny day for the vast majority. It is cloudier, however, compared to the last couple of days, courtesy of a cold front which has moved in. It's brought some rain to the northwest.